Bonjour, hello everyone. Today I'm going to get you through my watercolor painting process. I'll link every supply that I used on the description down below. So grab yourself something to eat or to drink and let's get painting. I always like to start my painting with a light wash of color, and it acts as the underpainting. Those colors are gonna influence every color I put over later on the process, and it's just gonna help make the color palette more uniform overall and make all the colors work together. It's always better to use bright colors because the colors you're gonna put over it is just gonna make it more dull, and the more pigments you blend, the more the color is gonna be dull at the end. So starting bright is always a good idea. When I mix my colors, I always like to mix just one color or two because, as I just said, the more pigments, the less bright your color is gonna get, and I just like having pure pigments on my paper. For the underpainting, I like to use a wet on wet technique just because every brush strokes you're gonna put is gonna fade on the paper and just blend naturally, and it's gonna give it more of a blurry effect. I also used this wet on wet technique for the background since I wanted a blurry background and not something defined. Between each layers, I let the paper dry. If you don't let your paper dry, sometimes your colors are just going to go to some places that you don't want to, and it's really hard to control watercolors. One rule that watercolor always follows is that the paint is always gonna go where there's water. So if you like your paper dry and there's no water at some place, well, there's no watercolor that's gonna go there. A very important thing is that you don't need to be afraid to put paint on, just because it's always gonna dry a bit more lighter and a bit less saturated than it is when it's wet. And another use of the underpainting is just that it takes the white of the paper out, and sometimes the white of the paper can be very intimidating. Plus, colors always seem a bit darker on white paper, and as you go underpainting, you realize that the color that you put is not that dark finally. Now I'm painting the snail. I always like to go from light to dark. The more as you go, you're just gonna render more and more. I always like to start and paint my big shapes, and after that render every small parts of the painting. Watercolor can seem a bit stressful by times, just because everything you put on you cannot erase. As with acrylics, by example, or oils, you can always work your lights when you want and work your shadow when you want. But with watercolor, you need to think about the light parts before even starting. But one thing that I always do is I like to set my mind off when I do watercolors, because if you think too much about it, it's not going to come as naturally, and it shows on the paper. What's beautiful about watercolor, and what's also very difficult about it, is that you cannot control everything, but that also makes it very natural looking. As my snail is drying, I work a bit on my mushroom. You can always use a blow dryer to dry your paper, it works, but I just like to work on some parts of the painting while others dry. As I said, watercolor is all about layering colors, so it's very important for you to be patient and just trust the process. For the long part of the mushroom, I wanted to give it a bit of a translucent effect. So sometimes I diluted my paint a bit more to just make it blend with the background. When you wait for your paper to dry, it always gives you some time to think about what is lacking in your painting. And what I saw is that everything seemed a bit dull, so I just tried to make the grass a bit more bright to have some kind of balance in the painting after all. It's very important to start with your main focus at the beginning and work your way around after, because sometimes you just give too much attention about some details around and not enough on your main character. And when you work on your main focus first, you just realize that you don't need as much details around it, because the main focus on the eye is going to be on the snail and not the grass, by example. So the grass can just be a big blob of color and it wouldn't really matter. If I would have started with the grass, by example, I would have put it way too much details on it, and the eye would just go directly to the grass and be like, oh wow, there's a lot of details there, but that's not where I want the eyes to look. So sometimes it's good to just put less details on some places, and it's just really gonna help guide the eye over the painting. Some people tend to put a lot of details everywhere on their painting, and it just looks a bit confusing by times. So choosing where you put the details is really helpful for the viewer. Now that all of the things that I wanted to put on the painting is on, I just rendered things as I go. As you can see now, I'm more confident into putting darker and brighter colors, and it's just going to help bring the painting alive a bit more. Don't be afraid to put bold colors and dark colors at places, and if you find yourself looking at it and being like, oh, this is a bit too dark, you can always use some white gouache, by example, or white acrylic paint at the end and bring all those lights back. The more traditional way of using watercolors always suggests to not use white, but there's no problem in using white. After finishing the watercolor part of the painting, I always take some colored pencils and render it more. Colored pencil can help bring very small details on the painting and sometimes can give you more control over the painting than watercolor. So using both is always a good idea. As you see, I put some green on the snail just because you always need to think about reflection of the light. So when the light hits the grass, it creates a green reflection on the snail. As you can see, it's really easy to bring more contrast with colored pencils. It's always good to think about decomposing colors. And what I mean by that is when you say color, it's not always just one color. There's undertones to it. So think of it as a long process and not just putting the exact good color on it. You can always start with a red and a blue and end up with a color much more complex. This is what I've done with the colored pencils. Sometimes you see the color as just brown, but there's undertones to it. So it's always good to add some pinks and some yellows and some greens to it. It's just gonna bring out the richness of the color, because brown is never just brown. At the end, I use a white gel pen to bring out some lights that I've lost through the painting. You can see I've added some reflections with the white gel pen. It helps bring out some contrast. So this is the final result. I hope that you liked the video and the process. Don't forget to put a like on it. I will try to get better at explaining what I do because it's the first time, and of course it's not always the best. If you have some questions about the process and the painting, don't hesitate to write it down on the comments down below, and I will try to reply as soon as I can. If you found the video interesting, you can always share it. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more of my paintings in the future. So thank you for watching, and I'm gonna see you on the next one, hopefully.